Today, I'd like to tell you about our sponsor, Swan Private. Now, you know from listening to this show that our money is broken. Fortunately, we have Bitcoin, a better money that will help us build a brighter future. But if you don't have a Bitcoin strategy and a trusted partner to help you execute that strategy, then you're probably going to fall behind. Now, I've known the Swan Bitcoin team for years. The Bitcoiners at Swan are mission-driven and have deep expertise and respect in the Bitcoin space. In my opinion, this is the team you want on your side. Today, I'd like to highlight Swan's Private Client Services division, which guides high net worth individuals and businesses around the world toward building and preserving wealth with Bitcoin. So visit swanprivate.com and learn how this concierge service gives you direct access to your dedicated Bitcoin advisor by phone, messaging, and email. Swan will guide you on complex areas such as self-custody, or you can choose to hold your Bitcoin through Swan with one of the largest US regulated custodians. So make your first purchase with Swan Private and get $100 of Bitcoin. Just tell them that I sent you. You know, an opportunity like this to build and preserve legacy impacting wealth for your family and company will not likely be seen again in our lifetimes. Sign up at swanprivate.com today, mention Breed Love to your advisor, and get $100 in free Bitcoin when you make your first buy.
Donald Hoffman, welcome to the What is Money show.
Thank you very much, Robert. Thanks for your kind invitation.
Really excited to talk to you. I had the pleasure of reading your book, which we're going to talk about today, The Case Against Reality, about a year ago. And it was, I actually read it right before I went on Lex Fridman's podcast as a guest. And I had read it in conjunction with this other book titled Leela by Robert Pirsig. I don't know if you've read that one yet, but I'll bring it up in our conversation today. I think there's some interesting connections to conscious realism, as you talk about in the book. So sorry, by way of introduction, you are Professor Emeritus of Cognitive Science at UC Irvine, and you are the author of the book, The Case Against Reality. And I guess I'll just open up with an excerpt from your book just to kick off the conversation, and we'll see which direction it goes here. And I'm combining a couple of excerpts here from your book, but you write that the purpose of a desktop interface is not to show you the quote unquote truth of the computer, where quote unquote truth in this metaphor refers to circuits, voltages, and layers of software. And you're making the case that perception is something similar. So perception is not a window on objective reality. It is an interface that hides objective reality behind a veil of helpful icons. Is that the approximate thesis of the book? How do you put the thesis of the book in a nutshell? I tried to choose a couple of excerpts that made sense, but I'd love to hear it directly from you.
Right. So the case against reality, the case I'm trying to make is, if we're trying to answer the question, do our senses report truths about objective reality? I see the moon. Am I entitled to say that there really is, in objective reality, an object that is round and has craters on it and so forth, and that exists even if no one perceives it? Am I entitled to do that? Am I entitled to take my perceptions as not exhaustively true and maybe wrong in certain points, but substantially true? That's the technical question. And when you have a question like that, you can try to address it as a philosopher. You can look at it, conceptual analysis and so forth. And that's been done for hundreds of years, millennia. And there's another way as a scientist that you can look at this, and you can say, look, we've learned a lot from the conceptual analyses and the logical analyses of the philosophers, but we can also do something else. We now have a theory, a scientific theory, about how sensory systems evolve, and that theory is evolution by natural selection. And as a scientist, I'm not claiming that theory is correct, but I am claiming that it is the best that we have so far. And as scientists, it's our duty not to be dogmatic about our theories and say that they're right, but it's also our duty to take our best theories and push them to the limits and ask them tough questions. And so that's what I decided to do, is to say, look, without being dogmatic about evolution by natural selection, I still want to see what that theory tells us, because we have no better theory right now for sensory systems, right? That's the best we've got. And so it turns out that that theory is mathematically precise now. We have evolutionary game theory, evolutionary graph theory, and genetic algorithms. And so it's not just a hand wave. It's not like, as you know, evolutionary theorists, we have to sort of, you know, shoot the bull and persuade each other. No, we can just do the math. And so that's what I, with my graduate students, Justin Mark, Brian Marion, and other colleagues, Chetan Prakash, Manish Singh, Robert Prentner, Chris Fields, Jeff Iverson, and others that I can't mention everybody, but so it's not just me, but we've looked at this precisely with mathematics and simulations, and the answer is very clear. The probability, according to evolution by natural selection, that any sensory system has been shaped to perceive any true structures, and I can talk about what I mean by structures, but any true structures of objective reality is precisely zero. And the only structure that evolutionary theory requires to be preserved is something called a measurable structure, a probability structure. And we can talk about that and its implications if you're interested in. So there is one that's required to be preserved, and that's required simply because to be a scientific theory, you must assume that the probabilistic structure of objective reality is non-trivially related, non-arbitrarily related to the probability structure of what we can measure in our experiments. If the outcomes of our experiments are probabilistically unrelated to probabilities of events in objective reality, then science itself is not possible. So because evolution by natural selection is a scientific theory, it requires some kind of what we call a homomorphism of measurable structure. It could be infinite to one. So it could be that the collapse is, is remarkably a lot of information is lost. But beyond that, evolutionary theory in its current formulation has no further stipulation about other structures like total order. Like if you think about the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 1 is less than 2, 2 is less than 3, 3 and it's a total order. 1 is less than all the bigger numbers, 2 is less than all the bigger. So it's what we call a total order. So total orders are not required to be preserved, and evolutionary theory says when you look at the math, the probability is zero that total order will be preserved. Metrics, topologies, all these things, and the reason is pretty simple. When I didn't realize this going into it. I mean, in retrospect, you look back and go, how I was pretty dumb. But you do the work, and then you realize that the logic is pretty simple. What we did we did a number of things to look at this, including genetic algorithms, and that really sort of tipped me off that evolution wasn't showing us the truth. It was just keeping us alive, full stop. It's about fitness, period. And when we literally take the theory as face value and it says, yeah, evolution is about fitness, end of story. That means it's not about truth. And it would be remarkable if it turned out mathematically that being fit also meant seeing the truth. And we might think intuitively it should, right? Surely seeing the truth would make you more fit. But we can talk about why that intuition is just wrong. But anyway, the reason intuitively that the mathematics is very, very clear that we are not shaped to see reality is if you look at the notion of fitness in evolutionary theory, when we mathematize evolutionary theory, effectively you can think about it as a game. We're playing a game. And so it's like you're playing some game like Grand Theft Auto or something like that, where you're competing with other people. Maybe you're trying to get points and you're trying to stay alive to get into the next level of the game or whatever it might be. I mean, there's lots of different games with different strategies, but you're trying to win points and get more points than the competition. And if you get more points than the competition, you will go to the next level. Well, in evolutionary theory, you don't go to the next level, but your genes, your offspring, go to the next, into the next generation instead of the next level. And so when you look at those fitness payoffs, mathematically, what they're saying is whatever the state of the world is, and whatever action you take, you could get these points, right? So maybe from 0 to 100 points or whatever you want. And so it's for every state of the world and for whatever I am and for whatever action I take, or whatever the organism is and whatever action it takes, there will be payoffs. And 0 might mean you're doing really poorly, and 100 might mean that's the best you could possibly do. You'll have lots of offspring. And when you just now look at all the possible fitness payoffs, and you realize that evolutionary theory puts only one constraint on those payoff functions, only one, and that is that they preserve the measurable structure. But there's no requirement in standard evolutionary theory that they preserve any other structure. So that means when we're looking at these fitness payoff functions, every possible fitness payoff function has to be considered. We can count all of the payoff functions. So if I have n states in the world and p payoff values, I can just literally count them as trivial combinatorics to count the number of total payoff functions. And then you can ask, out of that whole number of payoff functions, how many of them preserve this particular structure, like a total order or a metric or a topology, and just count those. So, and you put those in the numerator, right? The number that preserve the structure divided by the total number of payoff functions. And of course, there'll be fewer in the numerator, right? The number that actually preserve a structure, that's a special property to preserve that structure. So there's going to be fewer of them.
Right.
How much fewer? Well, it turns out as you let the number of states n in the world get bigger and the number of states p, the number of payoff functions get bigger, and you look at that numerator and denominator and look and divide them, and then look at the limit as the payoff values and the states of the world increase, it goes to 0.
Wow.
The ratio goes to 0. That means the probability is 0 that the fitness payoffs even contain the information about the structure of the world. And so if your senses are being tuned by fitness payoffs, and the fitness payoffs almost surely have no information about the structure of the world, then you can't be tuned to the structure of the world. It's a pretty simple logic. Now, I've gotten some pushback, which is of course welcome and expected from some brilliant colleagues and friends. And the one kind of pushback that I think is the most important, some of the pushback is easily answered and it's not worth going into. But the one kind of pushback that I've gotten from some brilliant colleagues and actually friends of my group is the idea that what if there are lots and lots of fitness payoffs for, so it's not just one fitness payoff function that's governing you, but there's lots of fitness payoff functions, the argument goes. And wouldn't that in that case mean that you could be tuned to the truth as opposed to the fitness payoff values? And there have been several arguments to that extent. So we've actually run our own simulations and looked at this a little bit. And the idea is most of them who are proposing this are looking at the fitness payoff over the entire world. And they're thinking that this fitness payoff is changing all the time sequentially. But if you think about it, what we're really facing is a plethora of fitness payoffs right now. So I look over, I see an apple. The fitness payoffs for that apple related to that apple are very, very different. Now I look over here and I see some poison ivy. Well, very, very different fitness payoffs for poison ivy. Now I've got a knife over here. Fitness payoffs, and as you realize, every object that you see is effectively a data structure encoding a group of fitness payoffs and the actions and so forth that are related to it. So the way evolution works is, of course, there are countless fitness payoffs out there. And the way we deal with them is not to get rid of fitness and just see the truth. What we do is we construct these nice little data structures that we call objects. And objects are simply representations of possibilities of action and payoff that I might get. The actions and payoffs for an apple are very different from the actions and payoffs of a knife or a car or nuclear waste, right? So the way that we deal with countless fitness payoff functions is not to just see the truth and not to see the payoffs. No, what we do is we create these artificial things that we call objects, and we also create space and time as data structures to deal with all of. And so when you actually allow, like in a genetic algorithm, for this, what we would call hierarchical clustering of all these fitness payoff functions, so that you can cluster them into these nice data structures, actions and payoffs that are roughly similar, we can sort of make this approximation that we'll call an apple, and it captures those payoffs, or this approximation that we call, and so forth. So once you do that, so we've rerun, for example, some of the simulations that our colleagues have proposed, and of course they didn't allow this clustering into objects. As soon as we allow the clustering into the objects, which is obviously what we see, then their results go away. So that's sort of a long answer to your question, but it's I would just summarize it as follows. When we ask the question, do we see reality as it is? We've done that with philosophy for millennia, and it's been very, very, very useful to think about it conceptually. It has not been conclusive, and you can be a good philosopher and take wildly different points of view. As a scientist, I realize we have this wonderful theory called evolution by natural selection. It's a brilliant theory. I love it, and I don't take it as the truth. As a scientist, I don't take any theory, including my own, as the truth. I take them as the best theories we have so far. And a century from now, we hope and pray that the scientists then will look back on our theories as quaint, and they will have understood what was wrong with the theories that we thought were true. We can look back a century or two at the scientific theories there, and we'll say, we can look at them and go, wow, well, they didn't understand this. They thought they had the truth. They should have understood this. And so we're no exception. So with that attitude toward evolutionary theory, not being doctrinaire, but recognizing that this is the state of the art. This is the best we have. We have no better tool right now. Then it's my duty to ask the question of that tool. And when we ask the question, we get a very, very clear answer. The probability is 0. Now, there's a couple of reactions that you can have to it. You could say, well, then we need to change the theory because I don't like that answer. Perfectly fine, right? You can. So the question is, if you're going to do that, how are you going to change the theory such that it accounts for all the data that the current theory accounts for? Right? It's not trivial. These theories get the respect of a lot of scientists, not because they're true, but because it's really hard to fiddle with them,
right,
and still cover the data. It's not saying you can't, but that's why it's usually an Einstein or a Newton who does it. This is not a Hoffman, right? So that's why we go with these theories. One way to think about a scientific theory is it summarizes hundreds or thousands of experiments. Like so for example, Michael Faraday in the 1800s is famous, rightly so, for decades of incredibly detailed experiments on electricity and magnetism and frog legs twitching and the whole bit. And he wrote down all these experiments, and the outcomes of the experiments. And James Clerk Maxwell, I think in the 1860s or something like that, or 1870s, I forgot when it was, looked at his experiments and realized that he could write them down in just a few equations. And so we call them Maxwell's equations, and they transformed the world. Our modern electronic industry is ultimately derived from Maxwell's equations. But Maxwell's equations, basically, you didn't need to actually read all of Faraday's experiments Of course, it's good to read them, and it's just good as a human being to understand what Faraday did and so forth. But
Right.
if you wanted to get the outcome of any of Faraday's experiments, you could just look at Maxwell's equations, and they tell you what you're going to get.
Right.
Right? So it's brilliant to summarize all decades of work. There it is. You don't have to have
Right.
like 30 hours of lectures. You just need, today we can do it in one equation. So all of Faraday is one equation. And when you understand that equation, you know all the possible outcomes of Faraday's. Now, it turns out that we have gone deeper than Maxwell's equations. So, and to do that is not trivial, right? I mean, Maxwell's equations do this incredible job. So the fact that, like quantum field theory does a better job is truly a stunning achievement.
Mhm.
And then the new work beyond space-time that's even leaving quantum field theory behind, it's truly stunning. But you can see the bar gets raised every time we go to a deeper scientific theory.
Right.
You need a new team of geniuses that are able to transcend all of what humanity has done up to that point and come up with a new conceptual framework.
Right.
So that's why I focused on evolution by natural selection and said, this is an incredible framework. I'm hoping that it'll be replaced in my lifetime. I'd love to see it be replaced, transcended, but it's not right now. And so it would be wrong to ignore it, absolutely wrong to ignore it as a scientist. And so that's why I take it very seriously when that theory tells us the probability is zero, that anything you see is the truth.
Wow, brilliant introduction. Thank you for that. I'm going to try and echo some of this back to you and then hopefully advance the conversation. So it seems like, perceptions are kind of the bedrock on which we've built our conceptions of reality. We've always just taken our perceptions to be true, essentially. And that's what this theory is kind of calling into question. And to your point, all theories ultimately are just provisional, right? Even past theories, we could look at like Newtonian mechanics. That was really just a lower resolution model of the universe. Doesn't mean that it's wrong necessarily. It's right in many cases, but it's wrong at certain levels of resolution, perhaps. But we need to do that work and then condense all of that into, as you're describing with Maxwell's equations, right? We condense those into something very simple, very economical, I would argue, right? All of this work is now distilled into just a few equations, for instance. And that seems to me the edifice of, the shoulders of giants upon which we stride, right? We stride upon that type of work, distilling past work into more universal equations, let's say. So maybe your point is that perceptions, there's something below the bedrock of perceptions for analyzing perceptions themselves, and they seem to be this ratio of actions and payoffs, perhaps. So I often go back to the logos here. I always think of the logos, in biblical terms and whatnot, always talking about the prevalence and importance of the ratio and the word. It sounds like maybe you're describing perception as something like that, right? It's a code, it's a ratio. It's an object-oriented programming comes to mind too, which I think you bring up later in the book. But so we are ultimately generating this sensorial experience as some type of a biological interface, according to your theory. And I guess the most earth-shaking implications of that are space and time, right? Space and time are, I don't know, the fundamentals of this user interface. What are space and time in this theory, and how is that divergent from traditional notions of space and time, but also concordant with some modern notions of space and time that they're doomed, as you go into later in the book? How do you explain that to someone that is struggling with that idea?
So I think at this point, the conceptual understanding of the moves that we're making here is very, very important. So with evolution by natural selection, what we've done is posed a specific question. What is the probability that anything that we perceive is true? The structure of what we're seeing is the true structure of objective reality. And the theory comes back and says the probability is zero. And the theory says what you're perceiving guides adaptive action. So those are the two things that the theory says: what you're perceiving guides adaptive action, and and what you're seeing is not true.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the theory itself does not then go on to say it's a user interface and so forth. It doesn't say all that. So I want to be very, very clear what the theory says and then where I'm going with it, right?
Yes.
So what I'm saying is, okay, what metaphor can I use for perceptions that are not telling me the truth, but are just guiding adaptive action? Because that's what evolution theory is telling me. And the metaphor that I think is the most useful, and if someone has a better metaphor, I'm all for it. But the metaphor I think about then is like a desktop interface or a virtual reality headset for a game,
software.
where that software where you realize, okay, like in a VR game, what I'm seeing is not the truth. Just like the evolutionary theory says you're not seeing the truth. And yet what I'm seeing guides adaptive action in the game. It lets me play the game. And just like evolutionary theory says, what you're seeing guides your adaptive action, allows you to play the game of life and hopefully have kids. So that's where I went with this metaphor. So I want to be very, very clear what the theory says mathematically versus the metaphor that I then put onto that. And so I think virtual reality headsets or desktop interfaces are a good metaphor for that. And I would just mention one thing that often comes up in people's minds at this point, where they say, look, isn't this self-refuting? You've used the theory of evolution to prove that none of our perceptions are true. Well, what about our perceptions of mathematics? Didn't you use mathematics to prove that mathematics is not true? And so you've shot yourself in the foot somehow, right? Self-inflicted wound here. And the answer is, the argument that I've given is only for sensory systems. So we've asked a technical question about sensory systems. It's not about our cognitive capacities more generally, right? So we have to be careful as scientists. We have to look at each one of our cognitive capacities under the theory of evolution by natural selection and ask, what is the probability this capacity would, in some sense, give us truths or some kind of verticality that we want? Now, in the case of mathematics, it turns out that there are going to be selection pressures for some facility with mathematics, because we need to reason about fitness payoffs. 2 bites of an apple give me more fitness payoffs than 1 bite of an apple. Even if the apple is not the truth about objective reality, it's the payoffs. And so evolutionary theory makes it very, very clear that there will be some selection pressures for some facility with mathematics. And it's not, I'm not claiming that it makes us into mathematical geniuses. Most of us aren't. Most of us can't even balance our checkbook without some effort. So we're not mathematical geniuses, but we do have some facility with math, and every once in a while the genes come together and you get, a von Neumann or a David Hilbert or some other a Newton or an Einstein. Well, Einstein wasn't a mathematician, but Newton was. and so you get these mathematical geniuses, and of course you just get the genius of Einstein, period. I mean, even though he wasn't a mathematician, I would say compared to most people, his mathematical level was a genius, right? So you get that kind of thing coming out, but it's not that there's selection pressure for genius. There's just selection pressure for, in evolutionary theory, for being able to reason about fitness payoffs and stay alive because you reason about fitness payoffs. So that the idea that there's some kind of logical self-shooting is not correct.
So
yeah.
What I'm hearing there, perhaps your focus, you're narrowing the focus of this onto sensory systems. This does not preclude our capacity or facility for logical deduction or mathematics, right? There can be separate domains of consciousness, perhaps, that aren't narrowed to this sensory system area. Okay, I want to. There's a lot of ground to cover here, so I'm going to try to pick a couple of things here. So it sounds economic to me, even perhaps the active perception in a way. It's like, how do you take all of this whatever is being perceived and convert it into data that's useful for the organism in adaptive action, basically. So the quicker you could interpret that data and put it to action, the better. Space and time then are these the base layer of this interface, or the primary quality of this interface, perhaps, on which these icons of fitness payoffs appear? And does that make all of this, the other thing I'm connecting this to is just a concept of useful fictions. We use a lot of useful fictions in the socioeconomic world, right? Nation states, businesses, money, time, calendars. You make the point about the train schedule later on. Is that what we're talking about here? That these are perceptions themselves, are perhaps some kind of useful fiction for navigating whatever truth is?
Right. So there's two answers to that. One is to say, what does evolution by natural selection entail? And then what do I think beyond that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the evolution by natural selection theory entails that space-time, whatever it is simply a perception that helps to guide adaptive behavior. And objects in space-time are just perceptions that guide adaptive behavior.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if I go on to say more, then now I'm adding my own interpretation and so forth. So,
right.
So I just want to make clear what's the theory, and then what's Hoffman now going on and saying his own thing.
Yeah.
Because you may not like what I have to say, and that's separate from what the theory itself says. So I'm trying to think about space and time. So they're not the truth, and objects aren't the truth. Okay, and evolutionary theory can't tell us more. It doesn't say what they are. Mm-hmm. Besides guiding adaptive behavior, the evolutionary theory does not tell you what's behind. Mm-hmm. What is, so you're not seeing the truth. What is the truth? Evolutionary theory says, I'm not going to tell you. I don't know. So the theory itself cannot tell you. And so that's why, as a scientist, I now have to take a creative leap and say, okay, now that evolutionary theory has told me I'm not seeing the truth, and it can't tell me what is the truth, this is the fun part of science, or a fun part of science. So it's fun to see what the theories themselves tell us. It was fun and it was stunning. But now it's also fun to jump beyond the theory and say, okay, now is the time to take a creative leap. And of course, I'm probably wrong, but you got to go out there boldly, be precise, and whatever you propose, here's the caveat. Whatever I'm going to propose beyond evolutionary theory, I have to project it back down and get evolutionary theory. So whatever this deeper reality is, I need to get evolutionary theory and physics and so forth coming out. So it's not that you just can't do anything you want. Well, to begin with, you can, but eventually, to bring it home, you're just going to have to give back evolutionary theory and physics and so forth. So what I'm proposing is that space and time, or space-time, is just a data structure. We've evolved, like computer scientists talk about data structures that let you do certain things easily. You craft your data structures to make certain actions go quickly and maybe without certain kinds of problems, certain kind of errors and so forth. So I think of space-time as a data compression format. We're crunching tons, probably countless dimensions of data, where I'm using dimensions intuitively. Yeah, we're compressing them into 3 dimensions of space and 1 dimension of time. It's probably a massive data compression, and objects we're probably taking thousands of fitness payoffs or whatever the reality is, and crunching them down into something that's trivial, like an apple or a knife or whatever. So so from a computer science point of view, what's probably going on is there's a massive data compression. And it makes sense from an evolutionary point of view. As you said, we need to do things quickly. Yeah. We also need to do things cheaply, right? You don't want to spend tons and tons of computation figuring out that, my arm is being burnt in a fire, and it takes you 10 minutes to figure out that your arm is being burnt in a fire and the damage is done. So you need to do things fast. And by the way, that idea has led, prior to our work, many evolutionary theorists to say that there are many cases in which selection pressures are against veridical perception. So Steve Pinker has a wonderful paper in 2005 called So How Does the Mind Work? And he canvasses 5 different ideas that were already extant then about why we could expect in many cases that we don't perceive the truth, or that our cognitive systems give us false ideas and percepts and so forth. And one of them is, as you said, you need to do things quickly.
Yeah.
and you need to use heuristics and so forth to do things quickly. And heuristics aren't always going to be right. That's why they're heuristics. And so what I'm saying in some sense is in line with what many other theorists had said before, but where we're taking a new step that is surprising is where we say even everyday middle-sized objects like tomatoes and chairs and forks, we're not right about those either. And most evolutionary theorists didn't want to go there. They would say, yeah, we can make heuristics and do things fast, and so we might not get it quite right. But the idea that evolutionary theory actually says, no, when you see a tomato, there isn't a tomato. There's something deeper, and the tomato is just a data structure. It's just data compression. Something that's nothing like a tomato, and space-time itself is just a data compression format. So you can see that this is a radical point of view,
right?
And that's one thing I would say about this is it's really wonderful that science does this. When Darwin first wrote down his ideas, he was thinking in terms of physical animals fighting other physical animals over physical resources and having physical kids inside a real space and time. That's how he was thinking about it. So the theory was founded in that intellectual, it was the physicalist, realist framework. And then John Maynard Smith in the 1970s says, well, we can take Darwin's idea about evolution by natural selection, and we can get the algorithmic core, the mathematical core of it, and write that down. And that's where we got evolutionary game theory. And that's the tool that I then used. He did that in the 70s. So it was in like 2010 or so that my students and I started. So 40 years later, after 30 or 40 years after John Maynard Smith does that, then we start to use his tools, and those tools then, which get the core of Darwin's idea, go back and say, you know what, these other ideas that Darwin had probably aren't right? They're physical organisms. Those are just data structures. The resources that they're competing for, those are just data structures. And so and that's the beauty of science, is that it tells you, a good scientific theory tells you where it stops. And it also can go back and question some of the initial assumptions that you thought were critical to the theory. We thought that realism and physicalism were critical to evolution by natural selection. It turns out, no. If you look at what is sometimes called universal Darwinism.
Yes.
For example, Dan Dennett talks about this quite a bit and so forth. When you look at universal Darwinism, the algorithmic core, that is what goes back and puts the lie to the physicalist and realist assumptions that most of us bring to the theory, and that I'm sure that Darwin brought to the theory. So that's the power of a scientific theory. I like to put it this way: it's sort of anti-dogmatic, right? It comes back and it says this theory stops right here. These are the limits, and these assumptions that you made are provably wrong. And the theory then says this is where I stop, and I don't know. I can't tell you what's beyond. So evolution is saying you don't see the truth, but I cannot tell you what the truth is. And most people really get bothered about that. Hey, how in the world do you go and say that evolution doesn't show us the truth? Wouldn't you have to know the truth before you knew that you didn't see the truth? Come on, you're caught in another. And it turns out, no, that's the beauty of science. The theory itself says whatever you're seeing is not the truth, but I can't tell what the truth is.
Right.
That's the power of scientific theories. And so that's why I love to do science, because when we just sit around and shoot the bull, we think we know more than we're much more confident than we should be. And our theories come back, and Darwin's theory comes back and takes a gun to the very intuitions, some of the intuitions that led to the theory, which is really, that's beautiful. I love that about it. So.
Wow, no, that's brilliantly put. So it's almost like Darwin was his own discoveries were the tip of an iceberg he didn't even realize. Um, and this, I mean, is this related to just the finitude of epistemology, perhaps? Like there's certain things that knowledge can't contain, perhaps the capital T truth. So the best thing we can do to be fit to capital T truth is to compress, right? Compress its data to things that are relevant to our actions. I mean, even words themselves or symbols that we're trying to put this thing in, that those themselves are really useful fictions, right? Like back to your earlier point on the moon, I think the Taoists have this old saying that the moon and the finger that points at the moon are not the same thing, right? These words and symbols, we're using their pointers to something, but they're not, they're just representations or icons, as you might say. Is this somehow, I mean, all of this seems, so I guess we're talking about intelligibility, perhaps, like the way we actually intellectually fit ourselves to the world, but it also seems to be related to the essence of intelligence itself, which is ongoing process of error correction, right? The theories are sort of saying, here's a frame, here's a way to look at the world, here's where it starts, here's where it stops. And then using those limited frames, we're trying to fabricate more universal frames and more universal theories. And that is this an ongoing process of, I don't know, intelligence or intelligibility discovery, something like that?
I think you're spot on. I think that's you really have hit it on the head. There are epistemological limits. We see that from evolution by natural selection, is saying you're not seeing the truth. That's a limit.
Mm-hmm.
But there is this more fundamental theorem that Kurt Gödel approved, 1930 or 1931 or something like that. There are a couple of Gödel incompleteness theorems. And what they basically say is, take whatever notion of scientific theory that you have, where it's a rigorous theory and it has axioms and it can make predictions, and suppose that theory has at least the sophistication to like do arithmetic.
Mm-hmm.
So, and most scientific theories do. Then Gödel says, well, in that case, I can come up with a statement that you can see is true, but it can't be proven within your theory, your mathematically precise theory. And if you take that new statement that is true, but not provable, and add it to your base set of axioms, you might say, oh, now I'm done, now I'm good. No, now I can show you a new truth.
Mm-hmm.
There's another, I'll pull another one out, and and I'll show you that one's not provable, but it is true. And you can keep doing that. And what that tells you is that any scientific theory that's mathematically precise necessarily leaves out, in terms of what it can predict from its productive rules, it leaves out countless truths.
Right.
And so that as your intuition, I think, was spot on. It means that there is no scientific theory of everything.
Yeah.
In principle, which means that there's complete and endless job security for scientists. That's the good news.
Yeah.
But as you say, spiritual traditions have been pointing to this as well, that they will say, the word isn't it, the pointer isn't it, the conceptual thing that you can talk about isn't it, that there's this deeper truth, and all the words that we use in the scriptures, whatever, are not it, and don't take it to be it. I mean, that's the source of, again, dogmatism and religious fears, when they don't understand that those words were not to be taken as fighting words, and my words are right and your words are wrong. Those were meant to be pointers to some deep common truth that all the various kind of religious and spiritual traditions are trying to understand about the human condition. But when we mistake the finger pointing to the moon for the moon, that's the source of, again, fighting and killing each other and so forth over the pointers, where the deeper thing is, never mistake the pointer for the truth. Don't get attached to any particular pointer, because it's not the truth. Always, and so this gets to something, the notion of pointers. See, this is again where science and spirituality can really interact in a positive way. What do we mean by pointer? And truths that we point to, but you can't actually define them conceptually. Well, I'll give you a concrete example. How do you have an 18-month-old child, and you're 15 months or something like that, they're starting to learn lots of words. So here's mom and dad, and there's their baby, Samantha, and there's a bunny rabbit on the carpet with Samantha. And at some point, if Samantha is 3 months old and you point to the bunny rabbit, notice the point. Now here's the pointer. You point and say bunny rabbit, it's going to go over Samantha's head. She's 3 months old. That pointer is worthless for Samantha. If you wait until she's 5, you've waited too long. You should have been doing the pointer earlier. So around 15 months, Samantha is now ready. You can point and say rabbit, and remarkably, she gets it. Now, it's remarkable in a couple senses. First, you didn't explain anything. You gave some vocalization, rabbit. That's all you did, and you pointed a finger at it. She had to do all the heavy lifting. She had to figure out what. So you didn't teach her anything. She already, in some sense, knows what a rabbit is. You're just giving her a finger pointing to the thing she already knows, and a label for it. So notice what you've done. You've not taken her any deeper into what a rabbit is. You've just pointed to something that she already knows, and you put a little verbal label on it. And that's how we learn language. And by the way, when you teach someone mathematics, this is an integer. Well, if you try to explain mathematics to a gerbil, good luck. You could be the most brilliant mathematical teacher, but all of your pointers aren't going to work, because and so it makes it really, really clear that this pointing relationship that the spiritual traditions talk about we can give it a much deeper conceptual analysis using the tools of cognitive science, where we actually can start to understand how this pointing relationship works. And there's a developmental sequence where a person is ready for it. Before that, Samantha, it would be pointless to use the pointers. And when you do teach her the word rabbit, what you've done is trivial. You said rabbit, and you moved your hand. Trivial. She's doing all, and that's going to be the same thing in spiritual traditions. What a teacher can do is trivial. What they're really doing is pointing to you to say, look at this inside of you.
Right.
And if it's not there, if you're not ready for it, the teacher can't do anything.
Right.
It's only when if you're the 3-month-old, you can't do it, but if you're the 15-month-old, you can. So there's this deep connection, I think, between the notion of what we call ostensive definition. So the technical term for what I just talked about, pointing and naming the rabbit, that's called ostensive definition. And that's what spiritual teachers are really doing. The best ones are trying to metaphorically point a finger at spiritual aspects of you, like your being versus your false self and things like that. Right. They're pointing at those. But if you're not in a position, if you're the 3-month-old, then you can't get it. If you're the 15-month-old, you're just ready to get it.
Right.
And so forth.
You're
absolutely right.
Sorry, perhaps this is like the zone of proximal development, I think they call it, where when you're speaking to your child, you should always be speaking to them kind of like just a couple of levels above where they're at. So they're sort of aspiring, they're imitating you often. So you don't want to just talk to them at their level. They will never grow. But if you talk to them slightly above their level, you're kind of leading them into growth.
That's exactly right. So if you take Samantha at 15 months old and she's starting to learn words, but you try to teach her quantum field theory, well, it's just not going to happen. And I should say one other thing about why this works and the miracle about how it works. When you point and say rabbit, and she gets it with just 1 or 2 trials, right? You only have to do it 1 or 2 times and she gets it. It's a miracle for the following reason. How did she know what you meant by the word rabbit? It could have meant the color of the fur or the texture of the rabbit's fur
Yeah.
Or maybe it was the left ear and the right paw, or the left ear and the carpet that the rabbit was sitting on, or maybe it meant the nose, or the right whisker. You can see that there's an
Right.
infinite number of hypotheses that Samantha could entertain when you point your finger and say rabbit. And notice if mom or dad points his finger and says quadruped, well, that's the wrong word. I mean, it's true, but you're messing your kid up. If you say quadruped, you're doing the wrong thing, and you know intuitively that it's wrong. So there is, between the teacher and the learner, in ostensive definition, there are unwritten rules. There are no classes where mom and dad learn, do not say quadruped, say rabbit. They just know and the baby is also knowing that mom is not going to go at this superordinate category level of thing. You don't go to the point to say thing. It is a thing.
Right.
That's the wrong level. And you don't say quadruped. You don't say mammal.
Yeah.
You don't say Peter rabbit either. It's too specific to say Peter.
Is it?
That's right. So you're right. There is a protocol. That's right.
And where does that?
The same thing is true in spiritual traditions now.
Oh, sorry, I had a little latency. Please go on.
Oh, yeah. So I like your question. Where does that emerge from? You're right that there is a protocol, and this protocol is taking effectively an infinitely complicated problem. There's an infinite number of hypotheses about what rabbit means. When someone says, look into your soul and be present, or let go of your false self, and they're giving you all these various pointers. Again, there's countless things in your inner life that could be referring to. And so there has to be, again, just like the parents with the child and the rabbit, spiritual teachers have to be in tune with, our spiritual development changes. The rate of development is very different from person to person. It's much more varied than our physical development. Our psychological development and spiritual development is very, very different. So a spiritual teacher would have to then actually be in tune with where you are and to give you the best pointers that they can. But the other thing is, and this is where science and spirituality can interact profitably. Science gives us ways to create pointers that tell us where the pointer itself has a limit. It says this point, like evolution and natural selection. It's a good pointer to all sorts of interesting facts about life and reproduction and so forth. But it tells us precisely where it stops. For example, you will not see the truth. So it's telling you specific things. And so that's really powerful, because that stops
disambiguation, right? To find the boundaries of these pointers, you don't get
that's right, the boundaries of the pointers, exactly right. And it gets rid of the dogmatism, because if you believe the pointer itself says don't believe any more than this. This is the end point of the pointer. And so that's where I think science and spirituality can work, as we work together, as we start to get more scientifically rigorous theories of spirituality. What we're not trying to do is desiccate spirituality. As we said, the truth always transcends any scientific description. There is no theory of everything. But that doesn't mean that we don't do science. It means that if we don't want to be dogmatic, if we're serious about spiritual things, we want to really progress and help others to progress and give them good pointers. Well, the pointers that we had 3,000 years ago may not be the best pointers now. How do we evolve new pointers that take us from where we are currently to the next level? Well, that's where science and spirituality can work. Not, again, that science is the final word. There is no theory of everything in science. And I'm not trying to get rid of spiritual realities. They transcend anything that we can say. Absolutely. But if we don't want to be dogmatic about our pointers, then science is the only game in town.
Well said. And it occurs to me that I guess one of the breakthroughs of this theory is like the perceptions themselves are pointers, or are useful fiction somehow. And I think this maps nicely to, if you just look at the visible light spectrum, right? We see what, like less than 5% of the total light spectrum, for instance. So we're tuning out a lot more than we're tuning into, per se. And it sounds like perception is maybe sort of similar in that we're just tuning into what is relevant to adaptive behavior and tuning out or compressing away maybe a lot of this other capital
Right.
T truth. But this mistaking the pointers for truth, this seems to be almost like a existential threat to dealing with pointers, right? It's like you're going to make a representation about reality. There's always going to be that danger of mistaking the representation for reality. And maybe that's what the Bible's talking about when it talks about idolatry and things like that, right? That you can't, the God that can be named is not God, right? The Tao, which we call the Tao, is not the Tao. So this
That's right.
non-dogmatism or this provisional attitude towards all pointers, and the understanding that, again, your perception itself is that you're just putting on, I love the headset analogy. And maybe, is this then related to like Zen koans? They have kind of no answer in a way, or like,
Right.
many of the great questions, their answers, their quote unquote answers are paradoxes. They're just kind of like pointing to the boundary of logic itself, perhaps.
Yes.
Or artists,
Yeah,
right? Artists using lies to tell deeper truths. Like these all seem to be related to me.
I agree, and I think that in some case, like the Zen koan, where in some sense the effect of them is to halt you in your track, right?
Mhm.
You halt and your brain catches fire, and you don't know what to do with it, and that's the point. Is all of a sudden your thoughts fail you,
Mm.
and you go into inner silence, and that inner silence, where you let go of all the concepts. Now, this is another step that we should go into, I think, is now you actually confronting the deeper truth.
Yes.
So there is this deeper truth that transcends any conceptual analysis of it.
Right.
And so this is now, by the way, I have to be very, very careful. What I'm now saying is not an implication of evolution by natural selection. It's not an implication of any scientific theory. So now I want to be very, very clear. This is Hoffman taking a fallible and creative jump and saying, what is the nature of reality? Or beyond, because it's not space and time, and so forth. And our scientific theories don't tell us what it is. So this is now Hoffman taking a leap, and he's almost surely wrong, but we've got to go there boldly and then try to be precise so we can. So this is how we progress.
Yes.
So I'm proposing that consciousness itself is fundamental, that you are consciousness, and that is the deep truth that Gödel's incompleteness theorem is pointing to, that says the truth transcends any conceptual. So I'm proposing that you're not separate from that truth. You are one with that truth, and that's so I'm proposing that consciousness is fundamental, and I'm proposing that science then needs to give a mathematical model of consciousness, which of course will only again be a pointer, and it'll never be a theory of everything for consciousness. But we again have to start and say, let's take consciousness as the object that we're building a model of, and then see the limits of our models. And in that case, the Zen koan is doing a very useful thing. In that model, I am consciousness, and I am not separate from the infinite truth that transcends any conceptual analysis. I am one with that. But I cannot know it through conceptual analysis directly. I can only know it in a couple ways. One is the Zen koan, which stops me in my tracks and stops all of my thinking.
It's meditation,
and
basically.
And effectively, I know it by being it.
Right.
I know it not through conceptual analysis. I know it because I am the truth, and I sit there, and as I let go of the concepts and just be, I get in touch with an infinite intelligence that is not separate from me. And this, by the way, my own attitude about this as a scientist is, this is where understanding this spiritual idea can be an incredible boon to science. When scientists realize that, of course, you need to be conceptually clear. You need to know your mathematics. You need to know your stuff, and it has to be rigorous. You have to be hard nosed. I'm not saying that we need to pull back on any of that stuff. It's got to be really tough. On the other hand, if you're only in concepts all the time, you're missing the deepest intelligence. And so this going back and forth between hard-nosed analysis and crisp concepts, and then complete letting go of thought and going into the unknown, that back and forth on this idea is going to be really essential for moving forward in science. And I think the best scientists really do this. Whether they're aware of it or not, they know their stuff, they know their math, they know all the facts, and they think hard about them, but then they give it a break.
Right.
And like Einstein was very, very clear that often in many cases, it wasn't math, it was some vague feeling, some vague image or something like that took him a long time to turn it into concepts and then turn it finally into mathematics.
Dim apprehensions. Sorry to interrupt. There's some great quote about dim apprehensions that we can barely articulate. I think you're trying to pull those down and codify them in words.
That's exactly right. And so here I see, as you can see, I'm not saying that science is the cure for, is better than spirituality or spirituality is better than science. I'm saying that we have two legs. We need to walk on both legs.
Right.
We need to have the science leg and the spirituality leg to walk forward.
Yes.
Or to use another metaphor, we need, what is consciousness up to? Right? If consciousness is fundamental, what is consciousness doing and why? And I don't know. But Gödel's incompleteness theorem suggests one idea that we should take seriously, again, not dogmatically. Gödel is telling us there's no end to the exploration of mathematical structure. In principle, there's no end. You can't be omniscient about mathematical structure. And if consciousness is what all there is, if consciousness is the reality, then the only thing that mathematical structure is about are the possibilities of consciousness, conscious experiences, conscious structures, whatever. So what Gödel's incompleteness theorem is telling us then, under this assumption that consciousness is all there is that consciousness in principle could never fully explore itself. So maybe that's what consciousness is up to, is the endless exploration of all of its possibilities and possible experiences. And part of that process may then be, what consciousness does is it says, well, to get to know myself, let me try on this VR headset. Let me try 3 dimensions of space and 4 and 1 dimension of time, and let me put in hundreds of trillions of stars, in hundreds of and trillions of galaxies, and let's put all this in there, and I want to really explore this. So I'm going to plunge myself in completely, complete immersion. I'm going to lose myself. I don't even know what I am. I think I'm this tiny little 5 foot, 6 foot tall, 100 to 200 pound thing inside this vast universe. I'm going to let myself go into that illusion, and I'm going to let myself really explore that and believe that and learn the rules of that. And like, I burn my hand in the fire, and I learn not to do that. My brother beats me up, and I learn what not to do to my brother. I steal things, and I go to jail, and I shouldn't, I do all this stuff, and I'm really learning in this interface. And then eventually I wake up and realize, oh no, I'm not that little thing. That vast universe was just a headset inside of me. And I've learned something new about me as consciousness. My consciousness has the capability of creating something that has trillions of stars and galaxies and is 93 billion light years across or more. And I can lose myself inside that, and I can eventually wake up. That's what I am. I was none of that. And now it's time, death then is the next step. It's time to take off this headset and move on to the next one. And I can't, for me, this headset is pretty limited. 3 dimensions of space. I want to be able to imagine in 20 dimensions of space or 100 dimensions of space. Why not? So you can see this. From this point of view, and again, I'm not saying I'm right,
Yeah.
but I want to put it out there with as much energy and pizzazz as
Yes.
possible to make it interesting, to say this is worth exploring, not dogmatically, but exploring rigorously, see where it leads, and then we'll try to get the next better idea.
Right. No, excellently said.
Now I'd like to tell you about a great new Bitcoin show on the scene that you've got to check out. Brought to you by Swan Studios and Bitcoin Magazine, this show is Hard Money with Natalie Brunell. Natalie is an Emmy-nominated journalist bringing unparalleled experience to the Bitcoin media scene. And personally, Natalie is one of my favorite voices in the Bitcoin space. Each week on Hard Money, you'll get the top headlines of the week with analysis you won't find anywhere else. Hard-hitting interviews with amazing guests like myself and other top minds in the Bitcoin space. And the show will take you directly into the lives being changed by Bitcoin all over the world. Check out Hard Money at swan.com/hardmoney. Today, I want to tell you about our sponsor, Crowd Health. So, how does health insurance work? You send an egregious amount of money to an insurance company. They hold it in a pool of depreciating fiat currency. Then, when you have a large health event, you have to pay them even more via your deductible. And then you hope they will cover your bill. And in fact, 1 in 6 bills are denied by healthcare.gov plans. It's time to take control of your own healthcare bills. I'd like to introduce you to Crowd Health. It's a decentralization of healthcare using Bitcoin as an alternative to health insurance. Instead of sending fiat currency to a big corporation, you send that money to an account controlled by you, a portion of which is converted into Bitcoin. Then, if you have a big health event, you have a community of Bitcoiners that will use the money in their accounts to help you out. To get more details, go to joincrowdhealth.com/breedlove, where you can find the promo code for $99 a month for 6 months.
I'm reminded that there's that quote, wisdom is silent. You know, you can't, we're trying to put all these words to it, but ultimately it can only be experienced, right? In meditation or something equivalent, perhaps. All right, okay.
Yeah, you're thinking of Rumi, maybe, right? Rumi
Was it
said
Rumi? Yeah.
the language of God is silence, all else is poor translation.
Ah, beautiful.
And that's really quite nice. In some sense, it's when you're have that inner silence and you let go of your concepts. In some sense, you don't know the truth conceptually, but you know it by being it.
Yeah,
and I think that Rumi was right about that.
And it speaks to you as someone who's had an on and off meditation practice. I've had it for long periods of time and off periods of time. It does speak to you, right? It's creatively inspirational when you go into that place. So, all right, to try to stay in pragmatic reality, whatever that means here.
Sure.
Are we then awakening? It seems to me it's fascinating that we're moving into this digital age, and somehow these tools we've developed now give us the lexicon to describe our own cognitive wherewithal, our cognitive architecture. It seems to me that perhaps software architecture and psychology have more in common than we've ever realized, perhaps. And I think your theory takes that to probably its bleeding edge. And I'm reminded what you're describing there with consciousness exploring itself, then I guess we're somehow, if everything is then conscious and then we are somehow that consciousness or the universe engaged in self-reflection, and somehow that is a learning or maybe the learning process. I'm not sure. I'll try to read, because this ties into some other very interesting areas like Ian McGilchrist's book, Master and His Emissary, where he describes sort of left and right hemisphere, what they're specialized for. I think this goes into, Peterson talks often about order and chaos. We have, the Taoist yin and yang, all of these things. So there's an excerpt here from your book I'd like to read. You wrote, actually, the evidence as we see it favors the view that the minor hemisphere is very conscious indeed, and further, that both the separated left and right hemispheres may be conscious simultaneously in different and even conflicting mental experiences that run along in parallel. Two persons with distinct likes and dislikes appear to reside and sometimes coral side by side inside one skull. Okay. And then the McGilchrist Peterson thing, like there's this theory that perhaps the left hemisphere is specialized for reductionism, classification, all of these things. I hope I have this right. The right hemisphere is more holistic, more yin, more open, more feminine. The right would be more masculine. It seems to me like there's something about this polarity between these two things is almost what creates reality. And the Buddhists had this concept of codependent origination, or that everything in the realm of forms and perception, like it arises from, I guess, this polarity. Is that what we're saying here? That I guess everything that we're like we can't get something in its own isolated, non-interdependent essence. That we're always kind of putting a frame around things and then establishing the polarity itself within that frame is the perception. Is that a way to put it, perhaps?
Well, I like that idea, but there's a lot to say about it. So under the idea that consciousness, so I'm going to talk, so Ian McGilchrist is a physicalist. So when he's talking about it, for example, he's taking a physicalist point of view on this. So we could talk about his stuff from just a physicalist framework. And if you want to, we can let go of the consciousness as fundamental stuff and just talk about, like, as a cognitive neuroscientist, what I would have to say about his stuff.
No, sorry, I should tell you where I'd like to go with this is toward, I'm staying on track with your book here, toward the neural correlates of consciousness.
Toward the neural correlates.
Yes. Sure. So sorry to interrupt, but yeah.
Sure. The neural correlates. So now I'll just talk as a cognitive neuroscientist and not about this, the deeper idea of consciousness is fundamental, but we could go there later if you want. My colleagues are doing wonderful work on the neural correlates of consciousness, right? This has been going on now for decades. And we have dozens, perhaps hundreds of neural correlates of consciousness that are very, very well documented. Great data. For example, area V4 of visual cortex. You have one in the left hemisphere and one in the right hemisphere. And if you take a magnet, a transcranial magnetic stimulation device, and touch it to the right part of your skull, just near that area V4, and put it in inhibit mode, while you're sitting there, all of a sudden you'll see all the color drain out of the right visual field. Then when you turn the magnet off, you feel the color, you see the color coming back in. Wow. And if you do it to the right hemisphere, then all the color drains out of the left visual field, and when you turn it off, all the color comes flowing back into the left visual field. Wow. So we can toggle your conscious experience by fooling with specific parts of your brain. All right. So most people would say, there you have it. That proves that the brain really does exist. All my stuff about evolution by natural selection, we don't see the truth, is clearly false. The brain is there, and the brain activity is causing the change in the color experience. So open and shut case against the idea that we don't see the truth. Well, and my answer is these neural correlates of consciousness are wonderful. The people who are finding them are brilliant, and I've worked on them some myself. And they don't entail that brains even exist when they're not perceived. I argue that neurons do not exist when they're not perceived. When you look inside of a skull, you will see brains and neurons. Just like if I have a virtual reality headset on, I look over and I see a red Porsche in Grand Theft Auto. When I look, I've created that red Porsche. When I look back, I look to the left and I see a white, a white Camaro or something like that. I create the white Camaro when I look, and then I delete it when I look away. So that's when I say space-time is just a data structure in objects or icons. We're creating those icons on the fly. So neurons are icons that we create when we look inside skulls, and so are our brains. So you might say, well, but then how do you explain why when I, with these neural correlates of consciousness, I inhibit V4 and the color goes away? Surely that proves that it caused it, because I'm toggling here and I'm toggling the experience over there,
Right.
in
It's
sync.
causative. Yeah.
Well, it looks like it's causative,
Yeah.
and but if you just think about just think a little bit about what you're doing in a virtual reality game, right? So I'm playing Grand Theft Auto, and I've got a steering wheel. I could say, well, I have a steering wheel, and so I'm seeing the steering wheel in VR, right? Maybe I shouldn't use the steering wheel, because you might also have a literal one. But imagine that you don't have a literal steering wheel, that you just have a virtual reality steering wheel, okay? And you have virtual hands that you see, and you're turning this virtual reality steering wheel. I mean, you could certainly do that. Many games do have a physical one in front of you, but I'm not thinking about those games. I'm thinking about one where you only see the steering wheel in VR and you grab it with your virtual hands. In that case, you could say, look, I turn this steering wheel to the left and my car goes left. I turn the steering wheel to the right, my car goes right. Clearly, there's a causal relationship between the steering wheel. The steering wheel really exists, and it caused my car, the turning of the steering wheel caused my car to turn left. Clear as day. No, the steering wheel only exists when you look. If I turn my headset this way, there is no steering wheel.
Right.
there literally is no steering wheel. So once you realize that, all the things that we think are knock down, drag out proofs that that the brain exists and spells the power, you realize no, they're trivially shown to be. It's just trivial that they're wrong.
Right.
But they have a deep grip on our imagination. But so I think the next generation that spends a lot of time in the metaverse will just get this. My generation doesn't get it. We didn't grow up in the metaverse. The next generation, when they take off their headsets, they're going to go, it's a no-brainer that what I'm saying is probably not the truth too. It's just a no-brainer.
Right. That makes a lot of sense.
Technology will help us.
That's interesting. Yeah, they have the technological realities we inhabit. They sort of retool our ability to talk about conscious experience itself, which is really interesting.
Yeah, we're upgrading to the next level.
Lets us level up. That makes sense.
That's right, we're leveling up.
Okay, so I want to read, there's so many things I could talk about here, but I'm going to try to stay on track. I'll read another excerpt from your book here. This is on neural correlates of consciousness, or NCCs, as we abbreviate them. You wrote, the path from correlation to causation, to be sure, is fraught with pitfalls. If a crowd forms at a train platform, then often a train soon arrives. But crowds don't impel trains to roll in. Something else, a train schedule, creates the correlation between crowds and trains. So to tie this, this show is called the What is Money Show. We talk a lot about economics and whatnot, but the train schedule, a calendar, money, I think these are all forms of social technology which are driving coordinated action among conscious agents. And there's something really interesting here that I'd like to pick your brain about, in that the consensus itself seems to neither be objective nor subjective, right? There's a fitness between these agents and the coordinating mechanism, whether it be a train schedule or calendar. And is that, does this mean that culture and its artifacts, I'm including the train schedule, the calendar, and money, is this kind of like a distributed database of these individual biological interfaces? So are we then using these useful fictions to construct kind of a collective mind or collective perception? And what does that say, if that's at all accurate, what does that say about the construction of our own perceptions? Are our own perceptions perhaps these consensus patterns of either a schedule or a train? I'm sorry, train, schedule, a calendar, or money. Is there a consensus mechanism to consciousness itself, in that we see consensus effectively extending consciousness into the larger collective landscape? I hope that made sense.
Yeah, absolutely. So I could take this in either deflationary or inflationary direction. So deflationary first, which is you could say, look, this is just simply, we can use evolutionary game theory to show how certain kinds of cooperation or conflict emerge when you have certain kinds of fitness payoffs involved and certain kinds of goals and so forth, you can get really interesting. So one way to take this is say, look, nothing really special here. We have the mathematics of evolutionary games, and we can look at how various strategies interact, and you can get cooperation or uncooperation. You can get competition in various situations. So we can set up different games, and we can get consensus building, or we can get competition and different strategies. So it's really, so this is sort of a deflationary thing. Is, by the way, I'm not saying it's not good. It's the best we've got right now. It's evolutionary game theory, and we can literally, it's the best tools we have for understanding economic cooperation and competition. There are no better tools than this kind of game theoretic approach. And the tools like this also explain why when someone yells fire in a crowded theater, most people get trampled to death when most people didn't have to get trampled to death. So we can actually use these things to see where consensus and cooperation happen and where we can predict that it won't happen. So it's very, very, so that's a beautiful field, and it's, I recommend people study it because it's incredible.
Do you have a certain recommended book on that topic, by the way? Just evolutionary game theory?
Sure. If you want to really be serious and understand it, but in the least painful way,
yes.
There's a book called Evolutionary Games by Nowak, N-O-W-A-K. I think it's called Evolutionary Games. If I can check and make sure that that's with the book right in front of me, but that's the book that I used back in 2008 or 2010 or something like that.
Wonderful.
I think it had just come out, and so hats off to Nowak and his book Evolutionary Games, because my students and we're not experts in this field, and we could use his book to boot ourselves up and start to do fun work. So that's the book I would recommend. If you want an even more informal book that sort of gives you the ideas, I highly recommend Steven Pinker's How the Mind Works.
Okay.
So a wonderful book, and also well, any book that Pinker has written, but The Better Angels of Our Nature. These books also play with these ideas, and Pinker is an exceptional, brilliant man on his own. I mean, he's a brilliant and original contributor, but he's also the exception who is a wonderful expositor of the ideas. So makes original contributions and brilliant exposition of it. So any book by Pinker in this area I would recommend. Now, there's a more inflationary way of thinking about your question, which is, let's take consciousness as fundamental. And that's what is consciousness up to on its own terms. And what if consciousness is fundamentally cooperative? What if consciousness itself isn't broken up? Maybe there's this one deep consciousness,
right?
And it's timeless. Could we show mathematically that any projection, any perspective on that consciousness the consciousness takes of itself would induce time as an artifact of the projection and induce the illusion of limited resources and competition for limited resources as the sort of an artifactual view of a more fundamental process that's not competitive, is completely cooperative, and there's no limited resources. And that's where I'm headed. I'm very interested to come up with a model of consciousness where there's no limited resources, there's only cooperation. It's trivial, by the way, to show that if you have a model of consciousness where there is no entropic time, so entropy is not increasing. So a Markovian model of consciousness, entropy is not increasing. There is some constant entropy, but it's not increasing. Any projection of that dynamics by conditional probability, it's a trivial theorem that the projection will lead to an arrow of time. It will lead to an increase in entropic time. So even though the fundamental system has no entropic time, any view of it, any projection of it, will have entropic time. And if so all of a sudden time was not a limited resource before.
Right.
Now time is a limited resource. What other limited resources are there? Perhaps all the
Well, it all comes down to
ideas that we
time
have.
ultimately. In economics, it's all about
It,
time.
it really is. And so once you see that that limited resource could be an artifact of projection from a deeper reality in which there's no limited resource, then see what's beautiful about this is, suppose then we get a mathematically precise theory of consciousness beyond space-time.
Yeah.
It's non-entropic time. There's no limited resources. Can we show a particular projection in which we get back evolution by natural selection as the view that occurs from a particular projection? So we could show that evolution by natural selection is a special case of a much deeper theory. That would be, for me as a scientist, just incredibly beautiful, because it shows how important evolution by natural selection is within our interface. It's a description of what's going on in our interface, but it's not true deeper. That description is an artifact of a projection of something deeper. So that's, I think, a wonderful direction for scientists to pursue. And that's how we're going to try to get also, I think, our current physics. You know, quantum field theory and Einstein's theory of gravity have to be just interface theories. Is there a deeper theory of consciousness that not only gives rise to evolution by natural selection, but also gives rise to quantum field theory and gravity as, again, an artifact of projection?
Wow.
That's where we need to go.
Wow, that is very exciting. This oneness, this one consciousness, or maybe God as one of the stand-in words, one of the pointer words we use here. That seems to be intuited in a lot of wisdom traditions too, right? That there is some unifying oneness to all of this somehow. So maybe that could be a gateway to that.
That's a really important point, Robert, because the theory of consciousness that I have been working on with my many colleagues that I mentioned, I would just say that we don't have a theory of the one consciousness. And I don't think I can.
Right.
I think that it's not just that I'm not smart enough. I'm
transcends
not.
theorizing.
I think that there's a principle.
Yeah.
And so what we're doing is, instead we're saying, let's get models of these finite conscious agents, we call them, and interact. And we can show how when they interact, they actually combine and create new conscious agents. And we can then begin to sort of climb our way up. Okay, when these create new agents, we're getting more complicated agents, we can start to climb our way up and go, okay, well, we're getting hints of what this one might be, because it's no less complicated than what we've done.
Right.
But what's really interesting is that it turns out the notion of infinity is not just one notion. It turns out there's something called Cantor hierarchy.
There's
an infinite number of infinities.
Yeah.
Right. So and each infinity is infinitely bigger than the infinity precluding before it.
Yeah.
And so as I start to look at how consciousnesses interact, and I realized that, okay, I'm going up this, I'll have to go up this Cantor hierarchy, and you can't get to the top. So so what we have is a theory of consciousness, which in its very structure is telling you you'll never get there. Which is really interesting. It will always, so I love a theory that's always saying, look, it's really good what you've got, but don't be deceived.
Yeah.
You have infinitely more to go.
Yes.
So that's what I think is good science. You take your math and logic very, very seriously. You learn as much as you can from it, and it comes back and tells you you're still just a baby. It's just a baby step.
Right.
There are many more steps ahead. So again.
Yeah, I'm reminded. I listened.
Science and spiritual.
Thank you. I listened to your episode with Tim Ferriss, and the quote you gave at the end from Isaac Newton, where he was talking about the end of his life. He felt like he was still on just a child playing with pebbles on the shore on the ocean of truth, something like that. It's interesting. It's
Brilliant.
Sort of paradoxical in that it seems very futile that we engage in any of this, but somehow simultaneously very fulfilling and meaningful to try and pursue these revelations, I guess.
I agree, Robert. I think one thing is very, very clear. Nothing that you build or buy or acquire you can't take any of it with you. So I build a Empire State Building. I build a reputation. I have a house. I have all these. You're walking away from all this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
No question about it. Everything that we acquire, you're walking away from it. No question about it. It's a game.
Yeah.
If you're in a virtual reality game and you get lost in the game, and it's easy to get lost in the game. You're just a little player inside this big Grand Theft Auto, and you get all emotional about it, and you're trying to beat the other, and you can lose yourself in the game. You realize that at the end of the day, I'm going to take my headset off, and none of that mattered. It was just a game. The game was there for me to learn something. It was an exploration of possibilities. Right. So that's what this is. The way I look at it. If you want a house, go get it. If you want to buy the Empire State Building, go do it, knowing full well that yourself, your identity, it can't be that. You're not going to take any of it with you. So this is not about what you get. It's about who you are and what you learn.
Right. Who you are and what you learn.
When you take the headset off, you're a different person.
Yeah. Yeah. Beautifully said. And this aligns a lot with my view on the world, where everyone should pursue their wants to their fullest expression, with the limiting principle of other people's person and property, right? Like, go and get whatever you want, so long as you don't steal or hurt others, basically, which is pretty basic morality. On that topic, I wanted to bring up this book, Leela. It's written by author Robert Pirsig. His real famous book was Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. He wrote the book Leela about I think 15 years later. And, Zen was a huge hit, probably one of the number one philosophy books of the 20th century, I think, in terms of sales. The second book, almost no one's read or even heard of, which is interesting. But
yes,
I see a lot of parallels. I've done a long form series on this book with another guy, and I've read it 2 or 3 times. It's very, very interesting. But the theory of conscious realism that you're touching on in your book, that is sort of, and correct me wherever I'm wrong here, consciousness is not emerging from physical reality. Consciousness is the ground stuff, right? Physical reality is, again, space and time are like data structures in this reality of consciousness, if you will. One point in the book Leela, and I hope I can entice you enough to read it at some point. I think you'd really like it. But one point that he makes is you can take the entire scientific corpus and you could replace A causes B with B values precondition A. So he's taking a similar, the book is very wide ranging, but his thesis is that reality is moral quality or value or excellence, that it's all about conscious choice, right? Even at the inorganic layers of reality, there are conscious choices being made that manifest in these patterns that we call inorganic reality. So it's all a marketplace, really. Which is also interesting in that if you look at economics, we have this theory very strongly for humans, right? That we're conscious actors making decisions in a marketplace, and there's certain emergent phenomenon that we can't predict, right? It's infinitely complex. But perhaps in our anthropomorphic arrogance, perhaps we don't extend that to the rest of reality, right? Animals don't make choices, they have instincts. Inorganic reality follows laws. It doesn't make choices, it follows laws. So we make choices, but everything else follows these laws according to the frames we've put on them. And I'm reminded here, so first of all, saying that, and your book as well, it's a Copernican-like revolution, right? You're like, I thought I was the center of the universe. Now I see this is the center of the universe. And it reminds me of that. You bring up Wittgenstein's question in the book, where they're arguing about, what would it look like? What would it have looked like if the Earth turned on its axis, right? Just by asking this simple question of, if the Earth was turning on its axis, what would that look like? And then we get this brand new theory that lets us reinterpret all the sunrises and all the sunsets across history all of a sudden look completely different to us just by this perspectival shift.
Right.
So I would love to hear, we talked about, I think we're butting up against morality here, right? We say, let's let everyone do what they want. There has to be some bound on that. Otherwise we're justifying evil in a way. How do you fit good and evil and morality into this framework of yours?
And also cause and effect and so forth.
Yes.
Well, so
yes.
a lot of things up there. One is that first, the distinction that we make between living and non-living things. A rock isn't living, but a plant is. That's an artifact of our interface. It's not a principal distinction. Similarly, the distinction we make between conscious and unconscious entities is an artifact of our interface. Right now, I am looking at you on a Zoom screen. There are certain pixels on my screen that are giving me insight that I call Robert's face, and are giving me insight into your what you're thinking, whether you agree or disagree. I'm getting an insight into your consciousness through those pixels. Those pixels are not conscious. I also see pixels of things that I call a drape or a door or a wall. And those pixels are the same as the kinds of pixels that I see for your face. The distinction between conscious and unconscious pixels, or living or non-living pixels, is not fundamental. It's just that certain pixels are giving me a portal into your conscious experiences, and other the ones that I call your face, and other pixels are not. But the pixels themselves are just pixels. And so space and time are just a data structure, like the Zoom screen is a data structure, and the pixels on the Zoom screen. So, and of any data structure, any interface is dumbing things down and making, getting rid of distinctions. And so the distinction, we think of ourselves as the center of the universe, right? We're the smartest thing on the block. No, and we're not the most conscious thing. And rocks, in some sense, we're fooled. We're taken in by our interface. This is before we wake up. When you wake up and realize, oh, this is just a head. So it's like a guy that's involved in the VR game, completely immersed and angry and really taking the whole thing quite seriously, and doesn't realize, wait, this is just an interface. And so once you realize that, then the distinction between living and non-living, conscious and unconscious, is not fundamental. And then the question comes up, okay, what are we here to do and why? And issues of morality come up as you and now I'll bring this other hypothesis that there is just one consciousness, and it's just exploring all of its possibilities. In which case, the distinction between Robert and Don is again an artifact of our interface. And the conversation we're having right now, and then any person who listens to this is all the same consciousness through different projections, learning from itself. So there's nothing special about this particular icon on the interface or the Robert icon. There's nothing special about those icons. This is just consciousness playing with itself, learning by this interaction. And so what's really interesting, of course, we see consciousness doing some weird thing, murdering itself in that point of view, right? But eventually everybody just takes their headset off. So by the way, I'm not at all advocating hurting anybody or any creature. I'm not advocating. I'm saying that there's this deeper view that ultimately what consciousness is here to do is to learn that I and Robert aren't different. When I really understand that we're not separate, that is love. When I realize that I'm not separate from the tomato, that I just have less insight to the consciousness that the tomato is an icon. So I'm getting this tomato icon, but there's this very rich consciousness behind, which happens to be me. So what really comes out of this is the deepest morality. So the morality that realizes that I see myself in a rock, I see myself in a tomato, I see myself in another person. There is no division. I am that's what love is. Now, while I'm waking up, I may do things like murder and steal and so forth because I'm still lost in the game. I'm still trying to You know, in Grand Theft Auto, I'm still trying to beat the guy with the Camaro. I'm really taking it seriously. I'm all heated up and so forth.
Right.
But when I wake up, I realize, oh, it was just a game. Even though it was nasty what I did, ultimately there was no real harm.
Right. Right.
Because the other guy's going to take his headset off too, and it turns out we're both the same. So morality is real.
Yeah.
Don't hurt. But what you're really learning when you do hurt people is ultimately you're hurting yourself.
Right. Yes.
So you can see there's this deeper perspective that comes when you go with the spiritual or my scientific realist, conscious realist theory of the spiritual realm, which again is not the final word. It's just a theory.
Yeah. No, it's a great way to look at it. That the less we get lost in that game, the better the world we create. Right. Like for you and I to engage in this conversation, I need to assume that you are a conscious agent, basically, right? That you have things that I can learn, and hopefully I have some things. Like there's a dialogical process that can only emerge if I don't just take you as some icon in my game, right? That there's a deeper thing that we're both animated by or animated for. I'm not sure. Is that kind of what, I go to the Bible a lot. I know it's not the only wisdom tradition on this, but it talks about this, right? Like honor the sovereignty of the individual, right? Love thy neighbor, love, putting love first. And as you're saying in this framework, love is that unifying force. It's converging even opposites. And it seems like and I don't know where, perhaps Christianity is a moral chronicle of agape specifically. I know love, there's a lot of different kinds of love. I think it's really focused on agape. That's just a comment. My question would be, what is the role of mythology in our own? And you could put in this the other useful fictions like money, like nation states, human rights, all these imaginary structures that we create to scale our cooperation and to scale our perceptions. So the market is a way of scaling our perceptions in a way. What is the role of those structures? What am I trying to say here? We have to create them. We know they're not real, but they help us get on better. So what is the role of these mythological structures in consciousness itself, I guess? Are we trying to scale consciousness into these structures? Like, what's going on?
Well, again, I think that from the point of view that consciousness is fundamental, consciousness is probably just learning about itself, knowing the old Oracle of Delphi thing, know thyself. And the process of knowing itself is endless. And what we're doing inside space and time, all the games we play, the things we buy, the competitions we do, this is all consciousness doing these things to explore itself. But then I think the VR headset metaphor is really helpful here. And it's a way to understand what the spiritual traditions, including Jesus and Christianity, have been saying to us. So I'll put it just in the VR metaphor first, and then say how I think it relates to these spiritual traditions like Christianity, which I was raised in. My dad was a minister, a Christian fundamentalist minister. But in the VR thing, right? Someone who gets lost in the game, what you would tell them is, Joe, you're lost in the game. Just look, everything that you try to acquire in the game, when you take your headset off, you're not going to have it anymore.
Right.
Relax. And also, Joe, sort of wake up and realize that you're not this little tiny thing, and the avatar is not you. The avatar in the game that you see, that's not you. That's just an avatar in the game. You're not someone in the game. You're in fact outside the game. You're a consciousness, and the game is inside your consciousness. And frankly, in everyday life, this is a spiritual practice. Just try walking through life saying, this is a headset. So forget spirituality. Just take the VR metaphor. Right. This is a headset. I'm playing a game. Can I feel can I feel what it was like to imagine that everything that I'm seeing this is just all a headset, and I'm not this body that I see, that I'm not this avatar. This is just an avatar.
Mm-hmm.
So everything, and it doesn't even exist when I don't perceive it. So if I don't see my hands, they don't exist.
Mm-hmm.
And if I don't see my avatar hands in the VR thing, they don't exist because I only create them when I look. Trying to actually spend some time in your everyday life where, like, you walk through, you're walking down the sidewalk. Okay, just imagine this is just a VR game. This is just an avatar. It's not me.
Mm-hmm.
I'm outside the game. That's the spiritual mindset. That's what all the spiritual traditions are trying to get you to do,
Mm-hmm.
because you're no longer a tiny thing inside the game. You realize you're the thing that's seeing the game,
Right.
and you step out of it. So now Jesus points to that when he says, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself. Well, what is the self that he's denying? Jesus wouldn't tell you to deny something that's true.
Yeah.
He's telling you to deny a fiction. What is the fiction? That you are your avatar. So Jesus is saying, when he's saying you deny yourself, he's saying, don't think that you're the avatar. And that if you think you're the avatar, then you are competing with Joe to get that Camaro in the you are, your whole sense of yourself is how much am I better than the other players? It's a comparative thing.
Mm-hmm.
And how much have I gotten? So when Jesus says deny yourself, he's basically saying, wake up, you're not the avatar. As long as you think you're the avatar, then you're comparing yourself, you're competing with other people, and I'm better than or worse than this other person, because you're lost in the game. But as soon as you deny yourself, which is basically saying, oh, I'm not in the game, I'm not the avatar in the game, I'm outside the game.
Mm-hmm.
And everything that I could possibly do in the game is going to disappear when I take the headset off. So that's why Jesus said, how difficult it is for the rich to enter the kingdom of heaven when you're attached to all these things. So it doesn't matter if you have the riches, if you're not attached, it's not a problem. But if you're attached to your avatar, then you will be attached to the riches. That's part the attachments come together. So if you're attached to the riches, then it's going to be difficult. The kingdom of heaven, what is that? The kingdom of heaven is realizing I'm outside the headset. That's the kingdom of heaven.
Wow.
I'm not something I'm the consciousness outside the headset.
Yes.
That's the kingdom of heaven. So this does really comport well with Christianity, and I would say the other spiritual traditions, once you get past the terminological differences.
Yes. Yeah. Well, great points there. And that it's fascinating to me too, that spiritual revelation that you are not the avatar, you're not the player in the game, that you're outside of the game. It also makes you resistant to worldly coercion, right? I'm just reminded here of, Solzhenitsyn and Viktor Frankl. They wrote about experiences in gulags and concentration camps. They said those that had really deep spiritual convictions were resistant to all of the things going on outside them, whereas those with less spiritual anchoring were more perturbed, right? They're more caught up in the game, I guess, lost in the game, as we might say. And maybe this points to the value of stoicism to non-attachment to your possessions, right? Even if you're rich, Stoics are fine, like be as rich as you want, but also engage in this practice of negative visualization and imagine that you lose it all tomorrow and try to have equanimity between both states.
That's right. I think that's what Jesus was saying in the Sermon on the Mount when he said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." The kingdom of heaven is this state where you're not attached to all these things.
Yes.
If your sense of identity is all these things that I have, I'm better than you, I'm smarter than you, I'm faster than you, whatever it might be. I'm not poor in spirit, I'm haughty in spirit.
Yes. Right.
Then I'm not going to enter the kingdom of heaven.
Right.
So if I'm poor in spirit versus haughty in spirit, the kingdom of heaven is where I realize there's no reason to compete with Robert, because I am Robert. And both Robert and I are outside of the game, and we're learning from each other. So now you've entered the kingdom of heaven, you're poor in spirit. I'm not better than Robert, and I don't need to be, and I'm not worse than Robert. Robert has certain talents that I don't have, and vice versa, but those are just talents in the game. So that's so you can take what Jesus said and take it into this VR metaphor and then begin to understand what he was really pointing to. And it's really, really hard. I mean, Jesus didn't have the advantage of all these nice metaphors that we've got to right now.
Right.
I think the virtual reality is such a help to understand what Jesus and the spiritual traditions are saying.
Yeah.
And this once again points to where I think the science and spirituality interaction can really, really be a help. But frankly, I didn't really understand what Jesus was saying until I got the VR metaphor.
Right.
Even though I was raised in, and I understand because probably most of the people who were teaching it didn't understand. Jesus was there. He was giving us all these pointers.
Yes.
But we're the 3-month-olds. We don't understand. We're not 15 months old where we can take the pointer and really understand it.
Right.
But maybe with the VR metaphor and so forth, it's a pointer that we can begin to use and say, oh, now I get it.
Yes.
So that's why I'm hoping it'll go with science and spirituality.
Very interesting. So I know we're coming up on time here, so I'll try to wrap it up. That in meditation, it seems like one of the recurrent practices is to try and look at what is looking, right? There's kind of this meta step outside yourself. We're always trying to look. There's an observer. We all have the internal observer, but we're always trying to look at what is actually engaging in observation. This constant stepping back, I guess, into maybe towards that one consciousness we described earlier. But, and this is, I like that line of thinking to relate it to money, actually, in that money is something we're looking through. It is similarly a perceptual apparatus, right? We use price signals to coordinate market forces. Market forces dominate the world, really. But the idea of tainting that perceptual apparatus or distorting that lens through which we look through creates really disastrous effects in the world. This is the corruption of money, which a lot of my work goes into. It's sort of akin to attacking language itself, where if you just attack the word, right? If we're talking about the Christian sense, the logos, we attack the logos, that it inhibits our ability to adapt, I guess, right? We can't, the very tool we're using for adaptive action now, we don't have consensus on the meaning of that word or that price signal, whatever it may be. And so we're thrown into disarray. What is it about this? Is that the through line here, that these theories, these perceptual apparatuses, these frames, we need to work towards consensus on their integrity to get on better in this world, to realize that it's a game, perhaps? Or I'm just trying to, so when we attack language or money, the world goes to hell in a handbasket is the punchline.
Right.
Why is that, and how does that fit into your framework, and how should we evaluate I guess language and money and their integrity in this world?
Well, yeah, you're absolutely right. So capitalism versus communism. Communism sounds great. From everyone according to their abilities to everyone
according to their needs. Yeah.
So it sounds wonderful. I mean, wonderful. We could live that way. I'm going to help you. I love you. I'm going to do whatever I can for you. You're going to do whatever you can for me, and we're going to share and share alike. Well, it doesn't work. The history of communism has been a spectacular failure, and we've seen that doesn't work. Capitalism seems dirty and grubby. It's competition, nature red in tooth and claw kind of thing. But it works, right? And we have the higher, you get the higher standard, the highest standard of living when you have capitalism with the right, guardrails. That's what you need. The Leviathan. You need the government to, keep greed within bounds and play, rules for the game. So we have to do that. But given those rules and enforcement of those rules, then we get what we find here in the U.S. and Western democracies. It's actually an incredibly powerful wealth generator, and people's lives are. So what gives here? Well, my attitude is that it may be the same thing as before, where at the deeper level of consciousness, we're all one, and it's all cooperative. But any projection gives rise to the illusion of time, the illusion of limited resources, and the illusion of separateness. And so while consciousness subjects itself to the illusion and plays according to the rules of the illusion, you better be a capitalist, because that's the only way that you're going to have, things get done. We might like to be communists, but to do that, you're going to have a complete change of heart. You're going to actually have to not see Joe as separate from me, but Joe as me. So as long as Joe is separate from me, you better be a capitalist. When Joe is me, and if I'm being selfish against Joe, I'm being selfish against myself, and I know it, then communism will work. Then communism works. So that's sort of my attitude about it. So I'm a capitalist right now because everybody I know is still lost in the game. So capitalism is the right thing. If humanity, consciousness as humanity, goes through a shift where the vast majority of us wake up and realize, oh, this is just a headset, and Robert's not separate from me, then, and when we really believe it, then and only then can we shift. We could then shift to communism, and it would work, because I wouldn't be competing against Robert. The reason why communism doesn't work is because we're still competing.
It doesn't scale, right? Because you are a communist, though, probably in your family, right? Like I'm a communist in my family. I don't charge my daughter for breakfast, and I give the shirt off my back for my family. But when you scale it up to the world economy, I'm very much a capitalist.
Yeah, exactly right. And it's really the sense of you and I are separate. We're distinct. We're not the same. That's the fundamental illusion.
Right.
The illusion is that I am my avatar, my body. You are your avatar, the body. So we have the separateness, and then because I'm identified with my body, I then, and by the way, because that identification is illusory.
Yes.
And I don't feel. I feel incomplete because it's actually false. I'm not this body, and now I need to actually do something to make up for the fact that I feel inadequate. So I need to get a bigger house than you. I need to get, so you can see the motivations come because it all comes from the false belief that I am this avatar, and you are your avatar and you're separate from me. That leads to the feeling of incompleteness that makes me have to have all this stuff. Not because I don't need to have all this stuff.
And
my needs are very, very simple.
Yes. Yeah. Your actual needs are very simple. And that illusion of separateness inside of a integrated nuclear family is diminished, right? Like you and your daughter and your wife and your family, like you're all kind of one unit. So therefore you're much more, you have a tendency to behave more like a communist inside of your family because the illusion of separateness is diminished. But on the world stage, it's very obvious that we're all, well, I guess we are more separate on the world stage too. So there is this kind of gradient we have to act across.
That's right. But maybe consciousness sets these things up with the nuclear family so that at least within the nuclear family, you get a hint that the idea of separateness isn't fundamental. And it's sort of conscience leaving itself some breadcrumbs saying that there's something deeper here.
Yes.
Right. Look what you're doing in your family. This is really true more generally. It's not just you and your nation state. Now it's you and all of humanity. It's not just you and all of humanity. It's you and all creatures. Now it's not just, but even what we call inanimate world, you begin to, so you see more and more deeply the unity behind it as you let go of the separateness. And so, but the nuclear family may be a starting point where we realize, okay, I get the first hints of this unconditional love with my child and my spouse. Yes. Even there, we're not good, we're not perfect at it, but it's like training. It's like training wheels on a bicycle. We're just learning to ride the bike of love in our families, and realizing that ultimately it extends everywhere. But it usually takes most of us a lifetime or more to wake up to that.
Which
is interesting to me. Why would consciousness let itself get so immersed that it doesn't even wake up in this whole lifetime? A really, really deep and interesting question.
Yeah, because it's not about any individual lifetime, right? It's this intergenerational ongoing game of inquiry or whatever it is. And maybe it sounds to me kind of like software bootstrapping in a way, that it's coming online more and more and more. And maybe those were the seeds Christ was trying to sow, right? You know, love one another, act as one family. It's not like you can just immediately put that into practice, but he's at least putting something there that we can bootstrap on, perhaps.
That's right. No, I agree with that. But then I think that we may find that at the very deepest level, if we could take the perspective of just the one and realize that space and time is just an artifact of projection, then the whole Big Bang through our whole evolution is in some sense just an artifact of consciousness looking at itself through a particular lens. Right. It's not in some sense, well, it's interesting. So I was about to say it's not deeply true. It's true of that perspective on itself, but it's not true in the deeper sense of it. And trying to understand what that means, I think, is going to be really how science and spirituality will want to move forward. What does it really mean that when we look at ourselves through a perspective, now we're getting this all the Big Bang and 13.8 billion years of evolution so far, and looked like there was no life, and now life, and then human life and competition. And that's what consciousness looks like through this particular projection. Yeah. Why is consciousness looking at itself through that projection? What is consciousness doing and growing and learning? What is the one doing, and how? And ultimately, we already have part of the answer. We know that conceptually, we can never completely understand it. And yet we are it. We know it by being it. So with all these pointers, can we, through a process of both the scientific ideas and the process of going into complete silence and being with ourselves and being with who we are without any concepts and going back and forth, is what somehow that process is what consciousness is about. And understanding, so I'm at the very limits of my thoughts about this right now. It seems like I'm pointing to something very, very deep that completely goes beyond me right now. But it's the kind of thing where I think science and spirituality working together will grow, and consciousness itself, in some sense, will know thyself deeply.
Wow, beautiful. Yeah, I really enjoyed this conversation a lot. This has been quite mind expanding for me. So thank you. I would just, that what you finished off there on, that this process is what's of primary importance. Something about this dynamic process, right? It's not a thing. We can't isolate it. It's a dynamic thing. And I'm just, again, the Mises inside of me, Mises is a great philosopher of economics. He would say the market process is irreducible. So I can't help but think, that very process you're describing, is that the same process Mises was describing in the sphere of just economics some 70, 80 years ago? And perhaps it is truly irreducible. Perhaps we cannot peer below that ongoing dynamic exchange process that you're describing.
Well, if one way possibly, we'll put it this way, von Mises is right if we stay in the headset. If we stay in the headset, then von Mises is right. But is it possible for us to come up with a scientific theory outside the headset? And it doesn't have to be the whole theory of all of consciousness, because we can't get there, but it could be the first, baby theories of consciousness outside the headset that could then show that von Mises is true inside the headset, but there's this deeper perspective in which we can, in some sense, reverse engineer what we call economics.
Wow.
And find that theory of economics is an artifact of a projection, and that there's a deeper view.
Wow.
This is kind of open question to pursue.
That would be extremely exciting. Don, sorry. Thank you again. This has been a great conversation. If you could please let my audience know where they can find out more about you or your work.
Oh, thank you. So I have a Twitter feed. That's Donald D Hoffman, DONALD, another D, so 2 Ds in a row, Donald D HOFFMAN. And so I usually tweet 1 or 2 times a week, some podcasts that I've done or some ideas that I have. And I keep pretty much on one theme. Is just this theme. I don't do politics or anything else, just this one theme. So people can find out about the technical work there in the ideas. I'll of course tweet this podcast when you're done with it.
Awesome.
So that would be it. And my book, The Case Against Reality. And if people are interested in the visual perception side, I have a book called Visual Intelligence: How We Create What We See, which for those for like photographers and artists and people interested in just how we see, that book is less philosophical in terms of consciousness and more about the specifics of how we create our visual worlds. It's more cognitive science. So if people are interested in that, I would recommend that book. So.
That's very cool. Very cool. I will link to all that in the show notes. And Don, thank you again. This has been a heck of a journey.
Thank you, Robert. It was a real pleasure. Thanks for the kind invitation.